The United States of America recently announced they would send 90 of the Stryker Infantry Carriers to Ukraine, and that's no small amount. It's enough for basically a whole battalion of 1,000 troops. I was deployed as a US Army infantryman to Iraq in a Stryker brigade combat team, so I actually have some first-hand knowledge and experience with its tactics and capabilities, logistics concerns, training, and of course many of its controversial weaknesses that we're going to get into. For once, I'm actually qualified to speak on something. I think there are two possible effective ways the vehicle could be utilized in either an upcoming offensive or defensive operation, and we're going to analyze the tough decision that Ukraine armed forces will have to make when it comes to deciding how to deploy this vehicle. The first option is using the Stryker to reinforce defensive positions. Ukraine could deploy the Stryker to a region that specifically needs their defenses shored up, or where they expect that they might have to make a tactical withdrawal instead of a planned offensive. There are increasing reports of Russian counterattacks and assaults all along the front lines in eastern Ukraine. Russia's taking advantage of the operational pause during winter and is trying to turn the initiative back in their favor. The pressure their assaults are putting on Ukraine in Bakhmut and Soledar is in turn making it more difficult for Ukraine to launch their own upcoming planned counteroffensive. I think the Stryker could be used to reinforce one single location as a defensive asset. It could be used in a location that is the most dire in need of repelling any Russian advance. This would free up the more heavy Western armor that has higher firepower and armor, like the Leopards, Marder, and Bradleys, to take part in a separate offensive maneuver. I reconnected with an old friend, Jason Dufresne, a former sergeant from my old Stryker platoon that I deployed with. He was a commander of a Stryker infantry platoon in the 28th ID, completed the master driver and 25U field level maintenance course. Dufresne was an XO of a Stryker company and led training missions inside the Baltic states, and I happen to know he's an all-around good guy.
Stryker isn't designed to support tanks. Stryker is designed to move infantry on the battlefield, to get them to critical point at critical mass. If there's a breakthrough, you can move infantry quickly forward to help consolidate gains.
The Stryker is a fast-moving, lightly armored vehicle with 8 wheels. There's room to carry an entire squad of 9 dismounted troops in the back hull, but we managed to squeeze up to 11 dudes back there with everyone basically sitting on each other's laps. We got real cozy whenever we needed to transport casualties or high-value generals with us around our area of operations. This means if the Ukrainian armed forces have the same level of disregard when it comes to the notions of personal space, they could hypothetically transport up to 1,000 soldiers, a whole battalion, in these 90 Strykers. The Stryker company has a major dismounted soldier advantage with 27 more troops that they can get out of the vehicle than a Bradley company. This makes the vehicle especially well suited for protected evacuations. There's an impressive video of the Ukrainian armed forces using an M113 tracked vehicle to medically evacuate a soldier in Soledar near Bakhmut. This is the kind of mission the Stryker could perform far better thanks to its lightning fast speed of 100 kilometers per hour or 60 miles per hour. But in reality, if you really want to floor it, I've seen it go even faster than that. And the ride is extremely smooth, which is useful when you're trying to evaluate a casualty in the back. My Stryker in Iraq was the designated medical evacuation vehicle. In my platoon, we had the medic assigned to our squad. I would help assist him with gunshot wounds and IED casualties in the back while we were speeding down the highway to a higher level field hospital at a larger base. This speed really came in handy then. One thing the vehicle could offer troops in Bakhmut is protection from incoming artillery fire. It's rated for all-round protection against 152mm airburst artillery fire, and it protects against overpressure effects from these rounds, which can be deadly on its own. It's estimated that as much as 80% of the casualties in the Donbass in 2014 were from Russian artillery fire, and reports from the front lines indicate this trend has continued in the most recent invasion. As of the time that we're recording this, it's looking more likely that the Russian forces are closing in and encircling Bakhmut. If the Strykers were deployed to this general area, it could help them with a withdrawal if it comes to that. Hope for the best, plan for the worst. But before we get into that, even for people who are far away from war, its impact is being felt every day. At the gas pump, on your grocery bill, even savings and retirement plans are being bled dry. But if you think you could just recoup your money with the usual investments, think again. People lost trillions last year as stocks plummeted and real estate cratered. Many people like you have realized there must be a more stable way to invest, like in a global market with low correlation to these falling stocks. a market that just hit a record high, one that you could get into with Masterworks. They allow you to invest in shares of fine art, a remarkably stable asset. In fact, Morgan Stanley says investment-grade art often experiences lower price volatility, even while other markets suffer. Now, Masterworks makes investing easy, and it doesn't take millions of dollars. And when it comes to selling their paintings and handing back returns, Masterworks has a track record of 11 sales, every single one of them profitable. Just in the last 60 days or so, their investors got back 10%, 13%, and 35% net returns. No wonder Masterworks has over 627,000 members, and paintings have sold out in minutes. There's even a wait list to get started, but you can click my link in the description to skip it right now. The US Army's Field Manual 8390 goes into detail on how to use the Stryker in defensive operations. Combat vehicles provide defending forces with the capability to maneuver to the delay of advance of a strong enemy force and then immediately change from a dynamic to a static defense or counterattack. So the mobility gives the Stryker the flexibility to change from defensive to offensive very quickly. And it's true, the Stryker was able to perform a wide range of missions in Iraq. We did everything from mounted patrols to dismounted patrols alongside the vehicle through urban and rural areas. We did casualty evacuation and route security clearance, which gets me to another great ability of the Stryker. You can defend supply lines with this beast, and that was my whole purpose in Iraq, was to defend one key stretch of about 15 miles of supply line that ran down the center of Iraq. Route Tampa was a main supply route that fed Iraq from Mosul in the north down through Baghdad and then Basra in the south, if I'm not mistaken. It's called Highway 1 on Google Maps, but defending this key stretch of highway was important for the convoy supply trucks that made their way to each combat outpost along the country. And defending a supply route involves a mix of offensive and defensive action, and it requires frequently running along the paved roads for hundreds of miles, which that kind of tempo of back and forth patrols can wear a tank crew and its vehicle down. The Stryker is amazing for this kind of work.
So I think from a reliability standpoint, it's a very reliable platform, especially when you're using it all the time. And then it's just a matter of when you have problems, what's the infrastructure, the knowledge base to fix it.
Defending forces equipped with the armored combat vehicles are well suited for this use as security. On the other hand, using the Stryker in an offensive maneuver could be useful too. I don't want to discount what this vehicle could bring to the table in offensive action, but in Ukraine, they would need to take a few extra steps of planning to make sure it doesn't go poorly. The 90 Strykers would allow Ukraine to quickly ferry 1,000 troops to the objective or a city or town, and in theory, they could even then return back to the back lines and retrieve more soldiers at that point. Although normally you would want to assign one squad of troops to a vehicle and then stick with that same vehicle for the rest of your time deployed. This formation of offensive Strykers would need to be mixed in alongside heavier vehicles with better firepower to cover the Strykers in offensive operations. This is because the Stryker has a major limitation when it comes to firepower. And this is where another curious design choice pops up. Every generation of the LAV that the Stryker is based on, LAV 1, 2, and 3, they at least have a 25mm autocannon turret up top. But the American Stryker version of the LAV-3 has no autocannon. It is instead fitted with only a 50 caliber machine gun or a Mark 19 40mm grenade launcher. The automatic grenade launcher is best used as an area weapon in terrain denial for the enemy, creates large dead space zones in the fight. It's best to take out any enemy anti-tank guided missile teams. These things can clear enemy infantry within 2,000 meters distance. Hey sir, can we get something bigger, like, I don't know, a 30mm cannon on top of this turret? Something that can actually go up against armor? That's a great big negative. What's this enlisted man doing talking to me? Yeah, I don't know what I was thinking. I'm just a dumb, stupid private. The advantage of the 50 cal is often overlooked. It has far more ammunition than if you had a 25mm or 30mm autocannon up top. The remote weapon system, the Protector M151, still requires a lot of maintenance, love, and care. I remember our old driver and gunner, the crew, would spend an extra hour or two each day making sure that the headspace and timing was correct and the weapon was calibrated with the thermal camera. But this is far less maintenance than is required for your 25mm or 30mm turret. An interesting development is the possibility that the newest 50 caliber technology that the Stryker uses might be all you need against a Russian lightly armored vehicle like the BTR or BMP. For instance, the BTR-80 likely has around 10mm thickness of steel armor, which would originally stop the American 50 cal, but the US developed an M903 slap 50 cal capable of punching through 2 to 3 times as much steel as its predecessor, meaning it can go through 13mm of enemy steel armor. I would be very curious to know if the Department of Defense is sending this 50 cal slap ammunition along with the Stryker. The maximum effective range of the M2 HB 50 cal is about the same as a Russian 30mm autocannon's 2,000 meter max range. The M2 HB can fire 1,800 meters for an area target and 15 for a point target. But if you look at most engagements in eastern Ukraine, they are far less than that distance due to the visibility limitations of the terrain. We're going to see that the military is going to do an about face on this autocannon decision though.
Like, oh, it's an armored vehicle. Well, all armored vehicles are the same. Bone of contention was how the Strykers are being used, because the guys that weren't used to Strykers wanted to use them like Bradleys. Bottom line was, like, they're all going to get destroyed if you do that.
So understanding where the Stryker came from will tell us a lot about how Ukraine could use it. In October of 1999, the former US Army Chief of Staff, General Eric Shinsky, outlined a bold new transformation plan for the Army that was meant to allow it to adapt to this post-Cold War condition. That's a fancy way of saying they wanted a lightweight force. They would be light enough to be transported by a C-130 cargo aircraft, but at the same time have enough firepower to protect infantry, that could deploy to various hotspots around the world and fight enemies that weren't heavily armored like Russia, because they thought at the time a fight with Russia or China seemed absurd. And it still seems absurd, but it's more likely. The plan was named after something that sounded like a great 1980s action flick, Objective Force. This would have the Army adopt to a flexible doctrine that it would allow it to deploy quickly and be equipped for a variety of operations. It would also be a proof of concept for the high-tech Army of the future, with its FBCB-2 sending vital information to the commander, who would then give that info to the dismounted troops. I was on the Stryker when it was still fancy and new enough that it required I get a top secret clearance level from the military in order to use it. Congrats to me, I can pass the most basic of background checks. The Stryker has a crew of 2, the driver and gunner, and technically you could add a 3rd crew member onto that list, the commander, who's often the squad leader, whose job is to relay the information and stay on the vehicle. In practice, this commander frequently dismounts off the vehicle to support the dismounted troops and stay in communication with the vehicle. The Stryker was a key piece of this early piece of the brigade combat team puzzle. The total of 4,900 Strykers that were created over the past 2 decades completely transformed the US Army's fighting philosophy at the turn of the century, from this large, heavily armored divisions into smaller, high-tech, self-sufficient brigade combat teams that could deploy anywhere in the world within 96 hours by a C-17 cargo plane, and then operate self-sufficiently for up to 72 hours. We have to remember, before the Stryker, you either had the heavily tracked M2 Bradley or you had that light-wheeled, unarmored Humvee. So the Stryker was meant as a kind of Goldilocks vehicle, not too big, not too small, just right. Chef's kiss. But I think the evidence shows that this strict top-down requirement that the US Army created may have led designers to be forced into a box. They needed to create an incredibly light vehicle, which has led to critics calling the Stryker unarmored and lacking firepower. It really pains me to have to point out the Stryker's flaws, because I have a soft spot in my heart for the vehicle that kept me safe in Iraq and was basically a second home to me. I'm biased towards the Stryker, but I'm going to be as objective as I can possibly be and acknowledge there are some major problems with it, especially outside a counterinsurgency war. When you put this vehicle anywhere near armored opponents, like it will face in Ukraine, it requires an extra level of planning that even the US Army Stryker Tactics Field Manual hints at frequently. Oh hey sir, can we get some added armor under the vehicle to protect against landmines, or explosive reactive armor around the hull to protect against Russian autocannons at least? Negative. I'll just go myself over here then, alright? There are a few downsides to the Stryker's high speed. Its armor is rated only to stop an incoming 14.5mm machine gun, or likely around a 50 caliber sized bullet in theory. It can take a beating though. It does have its limitations. I remember before I deployed to Iraq, we were given hour-long briefings showing destroyed, blown up Strykers that still made it back to base without any casualties thanks to its run-flat tires that can still allow it to hobble home even with only 4 or 6 of its 8 wheels. Rumors circulated around my unit quickly that the Stryker's unofficial nickname was the Kevlar Coffin, and that the armor on the bottom was paper-thin aluminum. Evidence this was true comes from the high-tech solution that we used to fix the problem. I was ordered to fill a couple dozen sandbags and pack them onto the floor of the vehicle beneath our feet. Then I covered those sandbags with Kevlar blankets for some protection against landmines. That was the standard operating procedure across our whole brigade at the time. Just some sandbags on the floor. The Stryker is very lightweight at about 19 tons, and its Caterpillar C7 engine gives it a 19.7 horsepower to ton ratio, making it incredibly nimble and fast. You're about twice as fast in this compared to tanks. Sending the Stryker to a location that is not advancing past the front lines will cut down on its maintenance and logistics problems, and using them in a defensive role will make them less vulnerable to their equivalent BTR, the Russian vehicle that, in a lot of ways, out-firepowers them.
All the ceramic armor that was on our vehicles, that was just, the hull was the basic hull and they bolted on all the other armor. So they just changed out what they were bolting on, or just got longer bolts and put more armor on. Yeah. So if your threat is heavier caliber autocannon, 30mm, you can put heavier armor on it, and now you have a vehicle that is more survivable.
The Stryker's thermal sights can see out to 7,800 feet away, or 2,400 meters, compared to the 330 feet or 100 meters that night vision sights are normally good for on your dismounted soldiers. This capability allows the vehicle to warn dismounted troops of threats which lie beyond the range of their night vision sights. I know the driver's thermal vision was narrow and limited though. Our driver felt almost blind with that version, and he drove like he was nearly blind as well when he accidentally demolished a building and drove straight through it on a night patrol. And he was actually a very talented driver and great at his job, it's just the vehicle had its limitations back then at least. The Stryker's vulnerability against armor was, in theory, supposed to be covered by the MGS 105mm mobile gun variant of the Stryker. And it had troops in the back with javelin launchers, but the MGS 105mm Stryker ran into problems right away. The LAV family of Canadian armored vehicles that had never been fitted with a 105mm cannon before, only autocannons, so its reliability was questionable at best. The Stryker vehicle tries to overcome some of its limitations against armor with the Pentagon's favorite buzzword, modularity. It comes in at least 18 different flavors, from mortar support to anti-air Stinger and energy weapon variants. Jeffrey J. Clark, Chief of Military History, wrote about this. Apparently, the US Army's response to criticism about the Stryker's lack of firepower was to point out that the heavier weaponry, like a 25mm turret, would prevent the Stryker from being air transportable. Guess how many unit Strykers were shipped to Iraq by air? Nope, they were sent by rail, then by cargo boat, and then by driving themselves. Hey sir, can we get Absolutely not. I was just gonna say, can we get some useless airlift capability, even though normally we're just gonna be shipping these by boat anyway? Why didn't you say so? Of course you could have that. They were flown into Afghanistan though, and it is possible that its lower weight might make it faster to ship them to Ukraine very quickly if they weren't already located in stockpiles in Europe. The self-imposed weight limitation by the Army, though, just for the sake of air transport, might have been a mistake. There isn't enough armor to stop 30mm rounds, anti-tank guided missiles, or RPGs. Critics of the Stryker have said the vehicle doesn't have enough armor and doesn't even have an amphibious capability. Its lightweight will allow it to go over any bridge in Eastern Europe, though. There has been a lot of talk about how this new Western heavy armor will be limited by bridges' weight and load restrictions in Europe. I've talked about this weight limitations on bridges before, and we do have to take into account that bridges do not simply just collapse right away if you go over it with a vehicle that's too heavy. It will weaken the bridge over time, and you are always running the risk that it could collapse if you're on it. But many of the contested bridges have already been weakened and blown up at this point, and troops in Ukraine on both sides of the fight are having to resort to building makeshift alternative bridges right next to these bridges anyway, which can handle heavy tanks. The US Army Stryker Brigade Combat Team Doctrine lists the vehicle's following limitations. It is vulnerable to enemy armor, artillery, and air assets when employed in open terrain. It has reduced company logistics systems, has no organic maintenance section, requires staging points before conducting operations. It's not designed to defeat a heavily armored force in a meeting engagement without significant increases in combat enablers. But if Ukraine does choose to use the Strykers on the offensive, page 83 explains how a Stryker battalion is used in offensive operations in urban environments. The battalion uses its infantry to seize key terrain and control local population. Its Stryker vehicles are used to block roadways and secure major avenues of approach. This was a tactic we frequently used in Iraq. We would drop ramp, go to get a foothold in a building while the vehicles blocked main roads, but we didn't have to worry about an enemy BTR armored vehicle contesting that road. From reading the Stryker battalion tactics and doctrine for defense of a position or planned withdrawal, I think the Stryker would be a great asset for massing a concentration of infantry on a city. Since the vehicles can transport many soldiers very quickly, it's a very effective evacuation vehicle and would prevent Ukrainian soldiers from being encircled, allowing them to fight another day on better conditions that they set. Most of the tactics my unit used the Stryker with in Iraq are located in the cordon and search section of the field manual, page 108 to 114. The vehicles are incredibly useful to lock down a section of a city, search for weapon caches, bomb makers, high-value targets, and it gave us the all-important element of surprise. Since the vehicles were incredibly quiet, we could sneak up on targets. Likely not a possibility in Ukraine due to all the advances in drone technology for surveillance. The hint that the vehicle has some major limitations comes from the Army's field manual that points out on page 34, Stryker-equipped forces also have good tactical mobility, but they possess less firepower and protection than armored forces. For offensive operations, it's suggested that Stryker units use terrain to maneuver outside of direct fire range and then employ their infantry to close with the enemy. This is the extra step of planning that Ukrainian commanders will need to do with offensive operations to account for the vehicle's limits. This isn't like a BTR where Russian troops can come pouring out quickly from various hatches around the vehicle. There is only one way to exit, and it's through a slow-moving ramp controlled by a hydraulic system, I believe. It takes about 15 to 20 seconds to drop the ramp, which can feel like an eternity, but it's moving a door that weighs 1,000 pounds, literally. Remember to keep everything clear of the ramp. My platoon crushed Kevlar helmets and M4 rifles into pieces with this thing. It's that powerful. Before we get into the vehicle's maintenance, which is a whole mess, I want to look at the Stryker's history of ghetto rigging modifications to make up for its design flaws. I strongly recommend the Ukrainians do this immediately when they get their Stryker. The vehicle was designed in 1991, when landmines were considered a non-priority threat, and protecting against it would have been a waste of money from that time period's perspective. The US Army's 5th Stryker Brigade lost 21 Strykers in Kandahar with a total of 24 KIA and 70 wounded. This led to the vehicle being redesigned today with a V-shaped hull to deflect landmine blasts, although it's unclear if those versions are being sent to Ukraine or not. The Army did invest $1 billion in upgrading the Stryker with the double V-shaped hull and 30mm autocannon on the Dragoon versions. They were also working on adding a 50 kilowatt high-energy laser to attach to a Stryker to lock on and destroy UAV drones. We also had the maintenance guys and gals at the motor pool weld on bullet-resistant windows around the top of the vehicle, or Victor as we called it. This glass provided the illusion of safety, which was good enough for me to follow orders and hang my head out of there. They rigged up a series of rebar metal bars as a kind of housing over the top of the vehicle, which we draped a sniper net over. It's like a camouflage net. The net is rated to stop incoming leaves, rain, and a strong gust of wind, but will do nothing against projectiles, except they do discourage snipers from taking pot shots because they can't guarantee a hit, and they don't want to shoot and risk firing at soldiers that will just give away their position. So we'll see why these are important shortly. The lack of side armor was also fixed by a giant slat armor cage that was hung around the side of the Stryker with a standoff distance of 50 centimeters from the hull. The idea is it will detonate warheads away from the armor ahead of time. The cage weighs an additional 5,200 pounds. They resemble the quote-unquote coped cages that we see on Russian armor. The additional 8,000 pound hull protection kit armor plates are hung as skirts around the vehicle and are actually very effective at stopping shape charges, but those are far too lightweight to likely stop a javelin or RPG. But the addition of this weight meant that the tire pressure had to be checked 3 times daily, and 11 tire and wheel assemblies needed to be replaced daily on the 311 initial Strykers that were deployed to Iraq. The problem with this upgraded, ghetto-rig, pimp-my-ride version of the Stryker is their mobility is greatly diminished. This can especially be an issue in muddy terrain, where I've seen the skirt armor get caught because it hangs low and it completely gets the 19-ton vehicle stuck in the mud. Strykers are rated to be able to recover themselves normally, meaning we tried hooking up a giant heavy cable to the back of one vehicle and tried to pull it out with another, but with all the armor add-ons and soft mud, we were unable to self-recover, requiring a 4-hour wait to call in a heavy equipment engineering vehicle, and you're just a sitting duck during that time. I don't know if the Strykers sent to Ukraine will have this armor add-on, but it's absolutely necessary to prevent an RPG or anti-tank guided missile from giving you a very bad day. Visibility in the back for dismounts is 0, though that's a common problem for armor 10 years ago. Visibility for your driver and gunner offered very limited situational awareness. The field of view for the gunner is relatively narrow, so it requires you open up the armored hull hatches in the back and have 2 or 3 of your squad stand up and hang out the back so they can provide eyes on with a 360-degree constant view of the battlefield. Hence the importance of a camo net over the top and welded ballistic glass up there. This way, if you spot a target, all you have to do is say the distance and direction into the headset comms, and your driver and gunner will instantly hear it and swerve to that direction. Normally, our Stryker driver used the comm systems for relaying important, vital information to me, like prepare for a bump in the road, or his belief that my girlfriend back home was likely with Jody at that moment. Just be careful when using the comms not to press the button on the wire that bumps communications to the battalion net radio, which is what I did, and then definitely don't talk shit about your company commander when that happens, because that'll be transmitted on the net all over the battalion. Maintenance on the Stryker is a giant bag of worms.
The front of the Stryker, there's like an access port where you can plug in maintenance computer, understanding the diagnostic part of the maintenance. There's a problem, it tells you what the problem is, but it's in English, all kinds of codes and things like that, because it's a lot of computers involved. It's a more complicated piece of equipment that way, which that may be more the challenge.
Due to the frequently damaged or broken down Strykers in Afghanistan and Iraq, the Army opened up what was called a Battle Damage Repair Facility, or BDR, located in Qatar, which turned out to be a very successful way of handling this. And I wouldn't be surprised if they're setting up similar facilities in Poland or nearby right now. 502 Strykers were repaired in total at this nearby BDR out of the war zone shop. This allowed for an operational readiness rate consistently above 90% for the Stryker. My point of view is that the version that I was with over a decade ago was still in its early teething phase when it came to some of its more complicated systems like the tire inflation pressure system, which would oftentimes malfunction in the heat and explode under the vehicle and deadline it for weeks on end. I have footage of my buddy Colin in Iraq who'd had to crawl under the Stryker wearing a garbage bag while he unscrewed the plugs in the bottom to let all the gas and oil leak out of the broken fuel line system that flooded our entire vehicle with diesel. Yes, I was riding around in basically a giant fuel tin, ready to go up with a spark. This would require a special Stryker replacement parts and lengthy service periods. On the other hand, it's going to have operational time that is longer than tracked vehicles, which wears out their tracks faster, especially after frequent daily use on hard pavement. So the way a battalion of Strykers and others work is that they have a headquarters, or HHC, and inside of that is what's called an S4 staff selection of officers and supply sergeants who are solely in charge and responsible for logistics planning. They primarily receive, inspect, inventory, store, issue, and deliver unit supplies and equipment. You have to fight with them frequently to get batteries. It's sometimes referred to as the Napoleonic staff structure because it has its roots in Napoleon's army planning. Most NATO countries use the general staff system. It will be important for Ukraine and their armed forces to designate sufficient manpower to staff these planning logistics S4 sections. The Stryker was initially called an interim armored vehicle because it was meant to be a bridge to the next combat vehicle that never ended up happening. The Army gave it a clear designation as to not be an infantry fighting vehicle like the Bradley. It's technically the infantry carrier vehicle. The name tells us everything we need to know about its doctrine. The Stryker is designed to carry infantry to the front lines and support their dismounted operations, but it's not meant to carry out offensive operations against enemy armored tanks. This was perfect for the kind of counterinsurgency operations I was involved in, where we would raid suspected terrorist homes at night and be gone before they knew we were there. But in a high-intensity armor-on-armor fight, their role might be limited. There have been many advances since I last used the vehicle years ago. In May of 2013, for instance, Kongsberg integrated a tactical system that was awarded as a contract to supply the driver situational awareness display and commander situational awareness display, which could greatly improve the vehicle's situational awareness. They've since worked to outfit the first Strykers with the Mark 44 Bushmaster II cannons beginning in 2015, which can engage light armored vehicles up to 3,000 meters, and more importantly has new effects on target like airburst rounds that explode above a target to hit enemy troops behind barriers. But only about 174 Strykers were upgraded to this version, and I'm pretty sure this is not what's being sent to Ukraine. The Stryker needs to be used with caution in an armor-rich environment. If this vehicle gets caught by a BTR, it's going to be at a disadvantage in max range and firepower, although likely have a similar armor rating. That's all I've got on my old beloved warhorse, the Stryker. I miss it oftentimes until I remember what it's like, and then I'm glad to be here hanging with you guys instead. I'm your average infantryman, Chris Cappy, over and out.